All right, we're on now. We're
There we go.
live.
Cool. That's it.
Okay, so how's things going in South Africa?
Yeah, not too bad. COVID's a bit of a mess. Politics is a bit of a mess, but that seems to be international at the moment.
True.
Um, yeah, we're just waiting for vaccine rollout for COVID, and then hopefully things can start returning to normal.
Right. Yeah, my grandmother, she's already on the list for the vaccine, and my mom, even though she's not as old as a lot of people who are on the list because of her health issues, she's one of the people who are on the list too. So hopefully they'll get the vaccine soon, and I don't know when I'll get it, but it's obviously more important for them to have it than me because they're at higher risk.
Yeah, I always thought that the vaccines they should try roll them out to um, sort of prioritize people who take public transport or are forced to take public transport
Right.
because that's sort of the biggest risk of spreading it, and you make sure that people can get to work without the risk of spreading the virus.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I mean, if you're a working class person, you're naturally going to be interacting more with lots of different people.
Oh, no, exactly.
Okay, so you want to tell us, what kind of like led you to atheism?
Ah, geez, well, that's better.
Long
I
story.
can't say that, no, not really. I mean, it's a case of I've pretty much always been atheist from as long as I can remember,
Okay,
which I think is a blessing,
right.
to use the pun. Yeah. No, it's. I mean, I've grown up with an atheist family,
Okay,
and as far as I know, even back towards my grandparents were atheist as well, largely.
okay,
I know my grandmother um, was brought up Roman Catholic, but she did the motions, but didn't really care for any of it.
right,
Just did it because the family was going. It was like, okay,
right.
I suppose I'll go. If they didn't want to go, I was like, okay, well then we're not going. It's fine.
Yeah,
The thing that I always find that I always wonder about, coming from that background of sort of always being atheist, um, I wonder a lot about whether I would have been atheist if I had been brought up in a religious family, because you never quite know, how different your thought processes may have
right,
been with a different upbringing, a different childhood, and
right.
so I have a lot of respect for people who manage to, they come out of a religious background and then sort of find something for themselves and be like, no, this is actually nonsense.
Yeah,
Um, as opposed to where I've come from, where it's just always been the case. I remember at school we had to do, what do they call it? Religious instruction, like once a week or twice a week or something
right,
for half an hour. And I always sat there and looked at these things and I was like, I don't know. This was when I was about 9, 10. I was like, what a lot of crap.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I grew up in one of those families where I mean, well, especially in the United States with Black Americans, they're a very religious community, and I don't think my parents were overtly religious, but I have a lot of overtly religious people in my family, and atheism is something that I never even contemplated really until until I was a teen. That's when I really start having doubts and questions. And a lot of people, they naturally assume that it has something to do with something emotional, like you lost someone or you didn't get something that you wanted, something that broke you down emotionally and made you, kind of drift away from God. But for me, it was really just things not making sense, things not adding up. And so
Yeah.
around age 14, I was pretty much decidedly an atheist. And in 2014 there wasn't like a YouTube community, there wasn't like a Facebook or anything like that. So as far as I was concerned, it just I was like the only one in my family, I mean, nobody else ever talked about it, or it's not even something that you really saw on TV a lot or anything. Now,
Mm.
you know, YouTube atheists are so big. It's like something that a 14-year-old growing up now knows that, they're not the only one. They're not the only one thinking
Yeah,
this way. So even after I did become an atheist, I wasn't very vocal about it because it's like, who are you going to talk to? And if you
yeah,
do talk to people about it, they're just gonna kind of like look at you like you're crazy or you need help, or the devil's trying to turn you away from God, that kind of thing. That they'll never consider that maybe you just rationally concluded that it doesn't add up.
yeah. And that's always been my thing as well. It's like, if you start rationalizing even the most basic things, the inconsistencies are so abundant and so numerous. It's just like, well, I find it hard that people can't see it, um, and it's across religions. And I kind of have perhaps a slightly extreme view, if you want to call it that. Some people might, with regards to atheism and religion. In that, I don't see necessarily organized religion as being like the bad part, and then the good part is having like personal faith that people want to have. My issue with religion as a whole, and it spills over into all sorts of other aspects, which I'll touch on in a bit, but is the concept of faith, of believing something against all evidence, of denying any evidence, of refusing to ask questions, of refusing to be swayed, which I think is the biggest key towards pretty much everything, all life, everything we do, all the sciences, all of the knowledge we have, all of the um, sort of moral code that we have is based on us questioning and arguing and debating with each other.
Right.
The moment you say, I'm not going to question this, there is no room for questioning, you must just believe something, then, you might as well believe anything.
Right.
What's to change one thing from another if you can't question it and rationalize it? And I see it happen sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when people have grown up being religious, and then they find atheism, and a lot of the time I find they often jump onto some other kind of superstition or sort of faith, unquestioning kind of belief. I find a lot of them end up in sort of new age
Yeah.
stuff or something else. And I'm like, well, you've just replaced it with something else. It's still the same. It's still the same mindset. It's still the same thought process, or lack thereof, maybe. But it's the same flaw, if you will, in logic. And I see it, like I say, across the board. So whether it's people jumping onto New Age or conspiracy theories, or even political ideologies. And I see, from South Africa, we see the political situation in America. I'm sure we get only a portion of what's going on. But it seems to me that there's this kind of extreme dichotomy where people refuse to talk to each other. It's people get sort of pulled into a particular ideology and a particular viewpoint, and then they don't question it. If you are a liberal Democrat in America, that you will then subscribe to these 10 different positions on various subjects like global warming and Donald Trump and whatever. And if you're a Republican, you've got the opposite, And it's not something that I think people have thought of and come to those positions on their own. This is something that they've been fed by, their friends, their family, their party representative, the news they watch, and they sort of just take it in and they don't internalize it and they don't question it in the same way that people don't question, their religious upbringing or, And so I find that it ends up being a similar kind of thought process. And that's why things like the whole cancel culture, I think, are particularly dangerous at the moment, because it's a question of don't ask questions. If you ask questions, you're part of the problem. And for me, asking questions and being difficult is the key to getting through all of these things. And that's also why I particularly like a lot of the, shall we call them talking heads, that like to stir trouble. And I'll use people like, now I'll use a range of them, but you get like someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, who's on sort of the right, and he's flamboyantly was doing his best to get under people's skin. I don't believe half of the things he said. I think half of it is just him trying to antagonize and get a rise out of people. But then you get people like Piers Morgan, who, I think just, was it yesterday or today, where he actually got fired from ITV for, having his opinion. But the thing that I appreciate about him is that I don't always agree with him. In fact, it's probably about, I don't know, maybe I agree with him about 30% of the time, let's say. But the thing is, I never know exactly what his position is going to be, because he doesn't sort of fit into a prescribed set of narratives. It shows me, and I can see that he's come to these opinions by thinking critically through the particular issues and deciding where he stands on it. And for me, that's the most important thing. Whether I agree with him or not, he's at least applying sort of a critical mind to it. And I think that's key, as I say, for all of these things.
Yeah, I remember years and years ago there was a talk. I can't remember what the platform was, but Richard Dawkins was there, and a Muslim gentleman in the crowd said that, how can atheists have a true morality if they can't have an objective morality? And Richard Dawkins said, maybe I don't want an objective morality. I want one that's argued, reasoned, debated. So there's kind of like this idea that you have to have an objective morality to be moral. And when we think about what you could call like subjective morals, it's not always a bad thing. For example, like 200 years ago, it was, definitely morally acceptable to own another human being in the United States. And let's say that was considered objectively right. It couldn't be changed. It couldn't be debated, or anything like that. We'd still have slaves. So,
yeah, no, exactly.
I don't know why people hate the idea of subjectivity. Well, actually, I do know why. It's because what they'll say is, well, okay, if this is okay today, then what stops somebody else, like Adolf Hitler, what stops him from, like turning it on its head tomorrow,
Yeah. Well, I think of, it was a Stephen Fry quote, and I'm probably going to butcher it. But also in a panel discussion, and he said, people desperately want simple answers to complex problems. And life is not simple. Life is complicated. And people don't want it to be. They want a simple answer where they can go, this is the answer, there we go, we're done. And now I don't have to think about it anymore because it makes me uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah, in that, I think that goes back a lot to like bias and kind of what we were talking about earlier, how, I don't know, maybe you can touch on that some more. You were talking about how certain students, they'll look at like a Babylonian or other Mesopotamian mythology and they'll say like, okay, this is myth, but, this right here, this is the true religion,
Yeah. No, okay, so just to backtrack a little bit. So, and I was at university in undergrad in Cape Town. And I did, so I'm an archaeologist, so I majored in archaeology. I also did social anthropology. And then in between that, I did a lot of courses in religious studies. And we did various different modules, and the one I remember that stuck out to me in particular was when we were doing the monotheism. So it was Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and their origins. So we started off with, ancient Babylon, Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc., the Greek mythology. and how much of an influence all of those had. And you have the same myths, but with different names. I don't know if you heard the story of Utnapishtim.
Yes, he was the like Sumerian Noah, and
Yeah,
yeah,
and the story is exactly the same, except his name's Utnapishtim. So we would go through these myths in class, and I could see students, a lot of them who were very religious, internalizing this. They could write their essays, they'd get good marks, and I could see, and I'd ask them and say, like, doesn't this make you question, or at least modify what you think about your faith, about your religion? Doesn't it make you think, well, actually, maybe, these myths could be a continuation. Maybe it's just a rewrite of the same myth, but it's the same thing. But most of them would say that, no, the Babylonian or the Egyptian one was mythology and just a story, but the one in the Bible was real. And I found that fascinating, how you could have something that's so blatantly, it's a
right,
complete copyright infringement of other myths.
yeah,
And it's myths that have been floating around, in that region for a good 3,000 years, and they get retold, and people put their own spin on it. I mean, we've all played broken telephone,
yeah,
but they couldn't take a sort of view where they were prepared to question their religion, to go, maybe what we've been told in the Bible is sort of just a version of the same story. But the story is the same, Even that kind of modification, I didn't see. It was just, nope, this is myth and the Bible is real. And that kind of break in mental capacity just did my head in. Excuse the
yeah,
pun.
yeah. So I did a video back in 2017 about how indoctrination can intellectually isolate you, and I kind of coined this term. Actually, I don't know if anyone else has ever used it before, but I called it mythological favoritism, because it'll be a very similar story, kind of like the situation you talked about, and they'll totally view the other one as fake or untrue, even though it's very, very similar, while viewing their own beliefs that they've been trained or taught to believe as, absolutely true. And one of the examples I used is the Popol Vuh, which is also known as the Mayan Bible. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
Yeah.
if you read that book, there's a virgin birth, there's resurrections, there's a talking snake, there's forbidden fruit and all this stuff. But if you were to tell a Christian that story, actually, in my backyard, I used to do bonfire stories a lot. I'd invite like a few people over and get a fire going, and I would tell a story. And the Popol Vuh is one of the ones I used to tell, along with the Epic of Gilgamesh. But my point is that if you tell somebody, that all these things that are, kind of central to a lot of these biblical stories are in the Popol Vuh, they'd view that as, they'd still view it as ridiculous, And
Yeah.
I think that a lot of religious people, especially Christians, when you kind of like make these comparisons with other mythological figures, they think you're just trying to be funny, or you're trying to be snarky. But the point is that rhetoric has its use. Like a lot of atheists will say, why would I believe that a talking snake tricked a woman made from a man's rib into eating magical fruit? And on the surface it seems very snarky, but like I said, rhetoric has its use, and when you phrase it like that, I think you're really forcing them to look at what it actually says. Because like when you say it like that, yeah, it does seem snarky, it does seem rude, but is that not what it actually says? It's kind of like,
Yeah.
it's kind of like holding them to the fire, so to speak.
Well, there was a paper I remember reading in my first year of social anthro, and we did, a few years later, I was tutoring that same course, and we'd give this as the first reading to all of our first years. And we did this for many years, and it was always amusing from our side. But we would give them, I'll see if I can find it later on and send you the link or send you a reference. But so it was anthropology, people think is, study of ancient tribes and whatever. They don't think that anthropology is also, your next door neighbor or football fans or, it's contemporary things as well. But there's this perception that it's, crazy man goes out to go live with rural tribe and learns how to live with them kind of thing. Right. That's the perception, which is, maybe in the 1920s, not anymore. And there was a paper where this is the first one we give them to read, which speaks about this particular tribe of people and all of their strange habits and rituals and how they would visit these magical mouthmen and who would then, tinker with their teeth and sometimes pull them out. And then they would visit, the magical herb man when they weren't feeling well, and he would give them herbs and then they'd feel better. And, every evening they would use these contraptions with a sort of a stick with some animal bristles put in it, and they'd, use it to clean their teeth. And slowly, as the course of this article goes on, it becomes more and more blatantly obvious that they're just talking about sort of Western civilization, but turning it in to sound like this sort of exotic tribe. And how many people just fell for it completely. They didn't at any point pick up that this is actually, mocking you, the reader, and making you question what you read. This was a good thing that we used for first years, because this was the introduction to, you got to think about what you read, not just read it and accept. But again, as I say, most people didn't pick up on what this was about. And it eventually made it pretty obvious, like the subtlety of it got reduced as the article went on. And I just think, I think people don't question things enough. People aren't reflective enough. I like to think that I do those things, but we all, do those things as out of habit, out of routine. You can't question everything you do. So there's got to be a certain point, and it's interesting, and this is like I started where, I wonder how much of that kind of critical thinking I would have had if I'd grown up, in a very religious household.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of atheists view someone like you and they're envious of you because they feel like you didn't waste so much time. Like I know atheists who came to atheism way later than me, like 10, 20 years later than I did. And, they're upset about it. They're angry about it because they look at it as like I wasted all these years when I could have been thinking critically, instead of praying for people, I could have been doing something productive. And like I said, I got out at a fairly young age, because 14 years, you haven't really started life yet.
Yeah.
And but
you're not fully formed.
Yeah, but the thing is, and I made a video about this too, I didn't go straight from atheism to rational thinking, because I think once you abandon religion, I don't think, the next step is automatically critical thinking. I started getting into a lot of new age stuff and even like occult stuff, and it's like I was searching for something to replace it. And once I had, critically analyzed all that stuff and come to the conclusion that, it was all nonsense, that's when I started like thinking critically.
Mm. No, I think that's definitely true. And like I said, this comes back to the idea of faith being a virtue, of not questioning being a virtue. And once you allow yourself as an individual or be brainwashed into thinking in that particular way, it's very easy for you to replace one with another. Like I say, you see, if you look at conspiracy theorists, for example, if you find someone who's a lunar landing hoaxer, chances are they also think that the president is a reptile and we didn't land on the moon, and chemtrails, they're trying to do this, and Bill Gates is trying to inject us with nanobots
Right.
to replace us, the body snatchers. And I find it's people tend to just, once they have that ability to be essentially conned, as it were, into a particular way of thinking, it's very easy for you to con them into something else.
Yeah, there was it's funny you mentioned that because not too long ago I was reading this article about, I think it was a university in Sweden. I believe it was in Sweden. They did a study and they found a link between teleological thinking and belief in creationism, because like teleological thinking is pretty much the idea that there's purpose in nature, like things aren't just there just by accident. Like for example, when I was a kid, the Bible mentor that I had, he told me that it rains, so that crops can be watered and people have food to eat, so like a teleological thinking person, they kind of see purpose in everything, even if it's not a good one, and this is how the minds of conspiracy theorists work. When they see something happen, like let's say a celebrity gets killed, they don't see that as just misfortune that naturally happens every day. They view that as, okay, this must be something big. This couldn't have just happened.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think while you were speaking, you reminded me of something as well. And I think this is often, you see it when you get debates between religious people who want to debate with atheists and want to argue against, their favorite is to argue against evolution and to argue against Darwin and say, no, Darwin was wrong. But what they don't realize, of course, is that, the theory of evolution has come a long way since Darwin. I don't think you'll find a archaeologist or paleontologist or any person in the natural sciences who would take Charles Darwin as this is the correct truth, and there's no questioning allowed. And so people still tend to think of, and I'm sure you've seen this, where you think of evolution as being like a ladder or a set of stairs where you're progressing to something better,
Right.
which is of course absolute nonsense. And people think, how are we going to evolve in the future? Or, think, well, we're using our hands a lot, so maybe we'll get like longer fingers. That also doesn't.
Right.
That was what was it? Linnaean thinking, where animals would evolve based on things they needed. So his sort of theorizing for giraffes was that giraffes tried to stretch their neck to reach higher plants. And every subsequent generation, the necks got a little bit longer. So it wasn't a bad idea at the time, but it's the other way around kind of thing. But a lot of people think as well that, with Darwin, you get sort of the idea of survival of the fittest. And people have a lot of misconception, and that idea has been expanded on a lot since then. So it's not really so much survival of the fittest anymore. It's more like, how do you phrase it? But it's survival of anything that's not detrimental. And a lot of evolution relies on that. So if you look at the evolution of flight from dinosaurs to birds, for example, you can't fly in that way without feathers. So you have to have feathers first, and they have to be there for a different reason. So you may have found that, the difference between feathers on reptiles at the time and then mammals having hair, at that point, it was just about keeping the animal warm. And completely coincidentally, it turned out that it was actually useful for something else later on. So a lot of traits that you developed, if you go back to that point, let's say in the Cretaceous period or the Jurassic. Now, I'm not a paleontologist, so my excuse if I get my time periods wrong, but you have to have feathers before you can fly, so therefore you're going to have at that period of time, the two options, you've got hair or you've got feathers. And at that point, it's only about keeping them warm. There's no other additional benefit. And so it only happens that whichever one happened to get the feathers was enabled it to fly at a later stage. So a lot of evolution is traits that are allowed to remain in the gene pool that are not necessarily beneficial, but they're not harmful either. So, I mean, if I'm born with pink eyes, it makes no difference to how I will live my life. As long as it doesn't affect my eyesight. If it happened to make me blind at the same time, well, then that's a huge negative. But if it's just a change in color, it makes no difference. And so that can be passed on for another 50, 60 generations until my ancestors want to move to, I don't know, Mars, and then having pink eyes turns out to be really beneficial.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think it's this progression of things are getting better.
Yeah.
Well, they're not getting better. They're just changing to suit the environment better.
Yeah. In Brian Clegg's book called The Universe Inside You, he said that people have this idea that evolution has your best interest in mind, but evolution doesn't have a mind. He said everything is, for the most part, a trade-off, and an example that he used is he said, a bird's bones are like really thin, which is bad because they're easily breakable. But, having those thin bones also allows them to fly. So, and, instead of viewing things as like a superpower, you have to view it as a trade-off, because that's more realistic.
Yeah, no, exactly. And there was another example I wanted to think of, but it's gone, like, I don't know.
Yeah, that happens to me a lot. The older I get, I swear.
Something evolution. I don't know. Never mind. I'll come back to it if I remember it.
Okay, so yeah. Now I'm kind of like, befuddled myself. Like, where was I about to go from there?
Yeah, and but like I say, I think people don't really think about evolution in the right way, and people think, again, with that sort of teleological thinking, as you're saying, they view how evolution works incorrectly, and then they argue. It's like a typical straw man argument where they build up what they think evolution is, and then they argue against that, which is clearly just, it's so wrong, it's not even funny. And yeah, it's see for me, that kind of stuff comes relatively naturally, being in archaeology and being in the natural sciences. And I got a science master's degree, so that kind of stuff sort of comes naturally to me. I think at this point, maybe I've been hammered into it through years of studying, but I don't understand how it sort of. I find that religious way of thinking so foreign and kind of scary almost. And I know you were saying earlier how you said you had one friend who had come to atheism quite late, and they were kind of angry about it. And, my response to that as being someone who's sort of always been atheist from when I was a child, is to say, well, actually, it's probably better that you went that route because, you know for a fact that you found that yourself.
Right.
Whereas, I like to think that if I'd been brought up religious or whatever, I would be able to come to those same conclusions myself and work my way out of it. But I can't say that for sure. I don't know if I'd been brought up Catholic, whether I would not be Catholic. Not with certainty,
Yeah, that's true. So, you kind of almost look at your atheism as something that was handed to you, like gift wrapped, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And like I say, now I've read everything and I do all this work, and it seems obvious, but I don't know if I'd been brought up religious.
Yeah.
Whether that would have been the case, I don't know.
Yeah, that it's true. It's good that you even contemplate that, though, because most religious people that I know, they kind of view their coming to God as destined, as like preordained that they're going to find God, or that, there's so many people who've told me like stories, like there was someone I used to work with, and they told me that their whole family died in a fire. And, they were like, this was God punishing me for not finding him. And so, it's sad and, insane as it sounds, they really thought that their family dying in that fire was God's way to bring them to him.
Wow. And that also brings another question for me when it comes to religion, and this is now obviously gets a bit more broad, but I kind of see you have people who believe in sort of a very literal, word of the Bible kind of thing, versus people who have a slightly more, shall we call it, a sort of a nuanced, moderated kind of approach, where they can think of it as being an analogy. And I think of, it was in that same series of lectures in my undergrad, we had a rabbi, female rabbi, which of course is already, what the hell kind of thing for most of it, because they're not allowed to be rabbis, but she's a female rabbi. And obviously takes Judaism with a very sort of moderated, filtered approach. And she would go through various parts of the mythology, and she'd be, for example, Moses parting the Red Sea and all of this. And she'd just be like, what a load of crap. You're a rabbi, you're supposed to believe this stuff. He's like, yeah, no, it's a nice story. It's got a kind of a bit of a moral behind it, but, it's just a story.
Yeah.
And that kind of approach to me, made me think a lot about people who believe in, I guess it happens a lot in sort of the American Protestantism kind of approach with, what do they call them, the charismatic churches and things, where it's about, your personal relationship with God.
Right.
And it's not so much about the Bible, it's just about how you feel and how you deal with it. And as much as I kind of, that kind of approach makes a lot more sense in a way for a lot of people, and it makes a lot more sense for me that someone could think about it that way. But on the opposite side of that, it also makes it a lot more difficult for someone to say to you, well, under what criteria can you be proven wrong? Because if it's just a warm, fuzzy feeling, then you can't be like, well, according to X, Y, and Z,
Right.
It's nonsense. So I think that also leads, it's got its kind of pros and cons. Ideally, I think it just makes it more difficult to have those kinds of conversations where you can change someone's mind. So it's, despite being perhaps less invasive on a person's personal life and less harmful perhaps to society, it's sort of more pervasive, more insidious, and more difficult to rationalize with someone who believes that.
Because like this is like a lecture that I reference more than anything else. This Sam Harris lecture from 2005 in New York, where he talked about the problems and the differences between moderates and extremists. He said, moderates don't fly planes into buildings, and that's a good thing, but there are some problems with them. And one of those problems is that they provide a cover for extremism. They're the ones who continually convince us that religion is not the problem. And, you brought up the example of the rabbi. And here in America, most of the Jewish people are what they call Jewish atheists. They're submersed in the culture and the rituals and the traditions, but they don't necessarily believe in a personal God. And I'll never forget, about 11 years ago, I was at this nightclub, and I'm waiting in line, and I see this Jewish guy. He's got a yarmulke on, and I kind of spark up a conversation with him, and I said, "Nice yarmulke." And I said, "I know this is gonna sound really dumb, but how do you guys get those to stay on without falling off?" So he pulls it off, and he's like built-in clamps. It's like, it's like I wish I would have thought of it a long time ago. So he and we start talking, and I said, you don't really believe in the story of the Exodus, do you? And he casually told me, like as if he was telling me about the weather. He said, actually, that's just a lie we've been telling for thousands of years. And I was just like flabbergasted that he was just that out and open with it.
Mm. That's the thing. I mean, I know Islam in particular has been getting a particularly bad rap, and for a lot of good reasons in the last 20, 30 years. But, and I don't know how it's like in the States or in many other places in the world, but especially in Cape Town, Cape Town's got a long history of Islam being a very sort of central part of life. Because, of course, now we're going back to 1700s, etc. And the British colonials and the Dutch colonials brought a lot of slave labor in, especially from the east, so from India and Indonesia, etc. And a lot of them obviously brought Islam with them when they came to the Cape. But it's always been a very moderate sort of form of it, where they practice it, they go to mosque and they believe and they go through the motions. But things like wearing headscarves and things like that, some of them would wear a little thing over their head, but not a niqab or something like that. Nothing that extreme, And I think maybe in the last 10 years or so, I've seen a bit more of that kind of extremist kind of ideology, which never really existed here. I think maybe but from personal experience, I guess, the Cape has sort of had a long history of, Christian and Islam communities living side by side and intermingling with each other, and getting along, and not really, I mean, maybe they're not best of friends, but
Right.
they haven't been fighting with each other. It's been peaceful and it's been cooperative, and it's, when there's a certain particular cause, like during apartheid, for example, and you've got racial prejudices to deal with, then you, as a community, now this might seem, I know the terminology for race in South Africa to Americans will sound very strange, but in South Africa, it's generally what you call, you have sort of, you've got your whites, you've got your black Africans, and you've got what are called coloreds, which is sort of like, somewhere in between, or, they have mixed parents, or
Okay.
their ancestry is from Malaysia or from India. It's also the Khoi ancestors, the Khoi descendants, who have that sort of in-between skin color and in-between kind of features. And that's sort of been obviously where the main sort of thing for this sort of, especially the Islamic influence, has been there in that community. But I don't really know where I was going with this.
And trust me, man, I'm 35, so the older I get, the more it happens. I'll get ready to. Actually, if you watch the last podcast I did with the Serbian guy, I said sometimes it feels like somebody just plucked the thought right from my mind. So
Oh, I'm 37 in a few weeks, so
okay.
I know the feeling. Yeah, where was I going with that at all? I don't know. I was just rambling. But, God, I don't know. Oh, I suppose we were talking about sort of moderate versus fundamentalist,
Yeah.
etc. So, the kind of Islam that, flies planes into buildings,
Yeah.
etc. As a vast majority, is not really visible in South Africa. It's always been a kind of very moderate thing. Although I think like I say, in recent times, I've noticed a little bit more of the sort of fundamentalist types. In the last 5 to 10 years, I've seen women in niqabs or in full burqas, which I'd never seen before in South Africa. So that was a bit of a shock when I saw
Right.
it.
Yeah, so it's not like Nigeria where, the Christians and Muslims have, like very violent conflicts and things like that.
No, not at all. I mean, there was so like I say, we've got a very, especially with um, I guess actually religion in general for a lot of, I guess maybe it's in the urban areas, but there's a very kind of moderate approach to it. And I remember in my high school there was a mosque um, quite close to our school, and they were considered sort of a very liberal. What's the word? Yeah, moderate liberal kind of institution. And normally it's, if you're not a believer, you're not allowed into the mosque and you're not allowed to do all of these things.
Right.
But they would invite school kids to come and see. And there wasn't, a religious ceremony. It was, have a look at the building. This is what we do here. This is what we believe. Da, 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 thanks for coming. And I think a lot of those experiences were very beneficial as well. Even if it was just for me to go, well, the architecture's nice, but that's about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I'll have to link you to that video. I think it's over an hour long, but I mean, the reason why I go back to that lecture so much is because I've never seen anybody so meticulously and calmly and rationally dissect religion and point out the differences between religious extremism and religious moderation. And one of the other things he talked about that's different between moderate and an extremist is that as you said, the moderates, they talk about how it makes them feel good, talk about how good it makes them feel. Whereas an extremist will talk about evidence, he said they'll say something like, or a fundamentalist, extremist, whatever you want to call them, they'll say something like all the things in the New Testament confirm the prophecies of the Old Testament. They'll say things like that. And, he said you can immediately tell they're on an evidentiary journey. It's not good evidence, but, you can tell they're looking for it,
I always think of, I forget who said it, may have been someone, maybe in Dawkins, I don't remember. But every single archaeological expedition to look for Noah's Ark or something religious has always been successful.
Yeah.
They've never not found something.
Yeah, did you ever hear about the guy? I can't remember where he was from. He took like a piece of wood and like put like some type of sauce on it, and I think he did some other things to it, and he basically contacted this religious news outlet and told them that he found a piece of wood from Noah's Ark, and they published it without fact checking it or anything because it appealed so much to their confirmation bias. I mean, it's just a hilarious story, and it really highlights really highlights an absolute lack of critical thinking or fact checking. So.
Well, I mean, I find it particularly amusing as an archaeologist because, I've spent collectively maybe 5 or 6 years sitting in a hole in the ground covered in dirt, digging with this tiny little trowel looking for like rocks. And, there are sometimes you go on a dig. There was one where up the west coast of South Africa, digging in the Middle Stone Age. So now we're talking between 50 to 200,000 years ago. Yeah. And so we're digging through deposits. We're about 2 meters down. And the layer I was there for 3 weeks was all roof spore, which is just bits of flakes off the ceiling of the shelter that have fallen. So it's during a hiatus period where no one's living there, and it's just slowly an accumulation of bits of rock falling off the ceiling. And I dug for 3 weeks, and I found absolutely nothing of archaeological interest. There was stuff above and below, But I spent 3 weeks pulling out just absolute crap.
Right.
And I mean, you go there to find something great, and then you spend 3 weeks essentially digging in your back garden.
Right.
It happens.
Yeah, I think most people have this, like Hollywood perception of what archaeology is. We think it's all like Indiana Jones, like really exciting all the time, every day, and there's always this big, momentous find,
I mean, geez, in the excavations I've been in, I found one or two really exciting things, but most people would probably not find them exciting. I think my two favorite finds from archaeological sites. One was from a site here in the Western Cape, South Africa, Middle Stone Age as well. A piece of decorated ostrich eggshell from about between 60 and 80,000 years old. So they would use these ostrich eggs as drinking containers. And the theory goes that, they would decorate them by scratching patterns into them as a way of defining, my water bottle and your water bottle.
Oh, that's pretty
I'm
interesting.
decorating this one and this way because this is my one. So it's a way of identifying them when you find them. And they would often, when on long trips, you'll find that they'd find a particular spot where they'll bury some and they know where it is and they'll come back later. But I mean, now we're talking, 80,000 years old that you find this little piece. So that was fantastic. So I mean, most people probably wouldn't find that exciting.
I don't know. I find stuff like that interesting because I think a lot of people, when they look at history, they want to know about how the kings lived and things like that. People who we consider very important. But I find, just like the everyday things, like when they're finding like pottery and utensils and things like that, I find that stuff really interesting.
Well, then you should definitely visit South Africa. There's
Okay.
lots. Um, the funny thing as well is that often, even here, when I tell people that I'm an archaeologist, and they go, well, is there anything left to find? Is there anything interesting here? And I can't walk through on any walk on any piece of countryside without finding something.
Right.
Within 15 minutes, there's kind of a low density kind of stuff across the landscape. When you know what to look for, it's just the kinds of things to look for pop out, where you know exactly what kind of features to look for. So, early Stone Age is going to be in a kind of, if you're looking near a riverbed where you've got kind of a little platform and you've got these kind of cobbles, and you just, there you go. That one looks man-made, and you can pick it up and go, yes, and yeah, it is. And most people will just step over them and not see it.
Okay, so I have a question kind of like relating to that because I don't know if you're a creationist, then you believe that the Earth is like 6,000 years old or sometimes younger. I think some people believe it's even 4,000 years old. But like when you're interacting with people like that, and you know that there's things that exist, things that physically exist that are way older than 4 or 6,000 years old. How do you reason with them, if at all?
Yeah, to be honest, I to go back to sort of a personal thing, I used to call myself, when I was maybe 18, 19, 20, I would call myself an agnostic. Um, and I realized later on that was actually the only reason I was calling myself agnostic, was sort of to make it slightly more palatable for people around me who are religious. And I was like, well, actually, that's nonsense. I'm not going to label myself something to make you feel easier about what I think. So from that point, I was just like, nah, I'm full-on atheist. Um, and if anyone sort of gives me a look of shock and horror, I'm like, well, that's your problem, not mine. Um, and when it comes to things like that with archaeology and with artifacts, yeah, I would say I used to get into those kind of discussions with people. Um, but and I forget who said it, but if someone, how do you argue a rational argument?
Oh,
How does it go? I think it's
I think
was it one of the Thomas Paine, I think,
I know.
one of the founding fathers of America. Anyway, that you can't rationalize someone out of a position that they haven't rationalized themselves into.
Thomas Paine. He said that trying to reason, basically, this is a paraphrase. He said that trying to reason with somebody who's abandoned reason is like trying to administer medicine upon the dead. That's how the quote goes. But
Yeah.
Sam Harris said something similar. He said that if a person doesn't value evidence, what could you possibly say to that person to make them value evidence?
Exactly. What evidence could you give them that would make them change their mind? And that again comes to that back sort of full circle to that thing for me of sort of saying that faith is a virtue or something, where it makes a virtue out of unthinking and of willingly being unthinking and willingly refusing to have your ideas challenged. So how do you, if you're unwilling to have your position changed, how is someone going to change your position? Because
Right.
there's nothing that anyone could say to you that makes you change your mind.
Right.
And that's sort of what makes me interested as well when people sort of find their own way to atheism from a religious background. How was it that you managed to sort of break that sort of idea of thinking, that way of thinking, and to question it? Maybe it comes naturally. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, with me, I feel like I'm part of the last generation that's really going to have to do it on their own in the Western world anyway. You got access to the
Yeah.
internet. You're seeing opposing opinions. You're seeing, you're hearing about different religions and things like that. If you're living somewhere like Saudi Arabia, where even professing your atheism could be a death sentence, you're not going to find common ground with other people. You're not going to find people
Mhm.
who, you might find people who are, on the same, spectrum as you, but they'll likely be afraid to talk about it as well. Like I have a friend
Yeah.
in Afghanistan, and she told me, I can't really talk about things like this with other people because I don't know who they are. They might try to get me killed. So,
Mm. Yeah, no, exactly. And again, my idea is going out of my brain. Um, you know, there's something about that as well, but it's also like when you get, and I think although the internet and the kind of information that's out there, it definitely creates a sense of community for people where they can see, people like Sam Harris and Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. At the same time, there's also, I see the opposite is also true. The internet is also being used as a mechanism for creating a space for bad ideas that are
correct.
spreading as well. And you look at conspiracy theories over the last, I don't know, 5-10 years. The whole idea that with COVID, that it's 5G and Bill Gates is trying to inject people with some kind of nanobot or something to track us, they say, using their smartphone. That, and I think that originated in the States, but it came to the point where here people were petitioning in South Africa about 5G towers, saying, no, you shouldn't install them. It's that's what's giving people COVID, etc. Well, as much as you create a community for good things, there's also a community for more nonsense. So it's sort of, you get the one hand, you get the sort of good benefit, and the other hand, it's kind of undoing itself at the same time.
Yeah, that's very true. Actually, I was talking to my dentist about that yesterday. Had to go and get a crown put in, and we were talking about, how prevalent, the misinformation is on the internet. I mean, there's people who, it's like they just don't know how to find credible information. Some people, they like sensationalism. Like I know a guy who automatically goes with whatever sounds the most outlandish. He's gonna go with that. But
Mm.
a lot of people, they just don't know how to find credible sources. They don't know what criteria to look for, so they'll believe anything. And
Well, I think as well, like on that, it's there's more information on available to people than there ever has been before, but that information isn't filtered in any way. So it's you know the good and the bad ideas rather than some kind of filtering process. Um, so you get as much bad ideas spreading as you do good, and I think you like sort of creating a sense of community for bad ideas actually ends up being almost more problematic. And you look at how the effects of COVID denialism, for example, and people refusing to wear their masks and stuff because they think this is oppression, and how much that actually affects the spread of the virus and how long the virus is going to be with us. It may even be the case that it may mean it's going to take us an extra 5 years before we actually manage to eradicate the virus completely, Whereas if people did what they should be doing, it could have been over in 3 years, instead of five or something. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I feel like history is really important because, most people haven't lived through a pandemic. Most people, they get like a yearly cold or a flu, and it's over in a few weeks. But they fail to realize that modern medicine and vaccination is what got them to that point. I don't know if you ever seen the Batman movie Dark Knight Rises, but
Yeah.
Bane told Bruce Wayne, "Victory has defeated you." Or in other words, you forgot what got you where you are right now. And I feel like that's how it is with science and medicine. So many people take it for granted because they haven't lived through something like that. So when they hear about a pandemic,
Exactly.
they're like, oh, it can't be that bad. We get the flu every year, or we get colds every
Yeah.
year. So